guys, welcome to 4K channel. Today I'm bringing you this gorgeous and iconic banknote from Confederate States of America. This is a $500 denomination from 1864, catalog type 64. We also have the Criswell catalog number 489. Now this banknote was part of the 7th and final issue, and this was issued by the treasury of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. And what makes this banknote so iconic is the large denomination, $500. Also, this is the only Confederate currency to feature a Confederate general and also Confederate Battle Flag. Now, approximately 160,000 of these $500 denominations were issued, and mine is serial number 8428. So we'll talk more about all the particular details of this banknote, but first let's talk about Civil War and how Confederacy came to be. So the Civil War started in 1861 between the northern states, aka the Union, and the southern states, aka the Confederate States. And it started when the Confederate States seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery. The southern states had plantations and slavery was very profitable. But northern states were more industrialized, and they looked down upon the southern states and wanted to abolish slavery altogether. So the South, under Jefferson Davis as their president, was fighting for their independence, while the North, under Abraham Lincoln as the president, were fighting for reunification. So the American Civil War lasted for 4 years, from 1861 till 1865, and over 600,000 people were killed, more than any other war in American history. Eventually, North would win. Confederacy was dissolved, and Confederate states were reintegrated into the Union through the period of Reconstruction, and slavery was abolished nationwide with 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So to finance the war, Confederate Congress, with Jefferson Davis as their president and Curtis Memminger as the Secretary of Treasury, they started printing their own currency, the Confederate currency. This was not backed by any hard asset like gold or silver, but rather by a promise to pay after the war, assuming Confederacy would win over the Union. So hence you have this promissory statement 2 years after the ratification of a treaty of peace between the Confederate States and the United States. CSA will pay to the bearer on demand $500. Now, the initial series of banknotes were printed in the North by the National Banknote Company in New York and were smuggled across the Union lines. But as the North created these blockades, it made it necessary to then transfer all the printing operations to the South. This particular banknote was printed, and it says here, by Keating and Ball in Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Thomas Ball was a Virginia lawyer who was tasked to seek out the help of a professional engraver, and he found Edward Keating. He was originally from England, and it was employed by the American Banknote Company in New York. So together, Thomas Ball and Edward Keating, they established their own printing firm in Columbia, South Carolina, and they printed majority of banknotes for the Confederate States, especially during the later years. And as the war went along, the material for the printing was in short supply. And this only got worse as the war waged on. This banknote is printed on a cheap, flimsy rice paper without any watermark. And this paper is, much thinner than what you would use for a standard currency. So it tends to wrinkle really easily. It can rip, and it, stains easily as well. Mine has, margin tear at the bottom, but it's hard to find these banknotes in, great condition just because the nature of a thin and flimsy paper. Also, this background pink ink that was used was also in limited supply. So the earlier banknotes are designated PF1, and that has to do with the fact that the earlier issues, the pink color was a deeper salmon pink color, while as time went along, you would have the designation PF2 because they would have to dilute the pink ink so that they could make the supplies last longer. And the final issues designated PF3 are actually more vibrant red color. This is because they managed to get new ink supplies. So if you have the PF3 variant, the background color is this beautiful, deeper red color, and these tend to be, serial numbers 35,000 or greater. And those banknotes with the PF3 designation and the red color are very desirable, and they'll cost you much more than PF1 or PF2, the standard pink or the light pink color. Mine is the standard pink PF1. The PF2, the lighter pink, almost looks like the whole banknote is faded, and it just has to do with the dilution of the pink ink. And in total, around 160,000 of these banknotes were printed, and the printing method was basically lithograph engraving, and which is basically a simpler but very crude printing method. And you can just see by the quality of the vignettes, these are not very crisp because of the printing method. These banknotes were printed in sheets of 4. You would have 1, 2, 3, 4, and they would have, plate position designation. Mine is plate position C, so the top note would be A, B, C, so this one is third from the top, A, B, C, D. Now, once these were printed, the clerks would stamp the serial number. Earlier on, they were actually handwriting the serial number but for this series, the serial numbers were stamped. And the interesting thing is that this particular serial number would be the same serial number for all 4 notes on the same sheet of paper. So 1, 2, 3, 4, they would all have the same serial number. And what makes them unique is the fact that you have different plate position. So the top note on that sheet would be 8428, but with plate positions A, and then B, C, and D. So that's kind of interesting how you could have two banknotes with same serial numbers, but the only differentiating factor would be the plate position. As war would go on, Confederate currency would increasingly lose its value. With soaring inflation, Confederacy would, print more and more paper money, and in the end, after losing the war, it became totally worthless. Now let's take a look at the design of this note. On either side here, we have the denomination 500. $500 was a large sum of money back then. It is still now, but back then it was a large sum of money. And this is only the second highest denomination ever issued. I believe they had a $1,000 bond that was issued. Down here we have the Confederate States of America, number, and then the hand stamped serial number underneath it. And down here we have will pay to the bearer on demand $500, Richmond, Virginia. Now Richmond was the capital for the Confederacy. And down here we have 17 February 1864, which was the Act of Congress, Confederacy Congress, that led to printing of these 1864 series of banknotes. And underneath that, in this little rectangular block, we have two signatures. On the left, we have the Register of the Treasury, and then the Treasurer of Treasury. Now, the interesting part about these hand signatures is the fact that they are hand signed, basically ink on paper. And these notes being hand signed was really important, and it was one of the security features. Now, something a lot of people may not know is the fact that this is not the actual signature of this person, and neither is this one. Now, the reason behind that is over 80 million Confederate States of America banknotes were issued in 4 years. So there was no way that these two guys, could sit down and sign all these notes. So what Treasury Department would do is they would hire clerks. And I think over the period of 4 years, they hired around 300 clerks or more, whose job was to then hand stamp each banknote, hand sign the banknote, and then cut the banknote. And in 1864, majority of these clerks were women, and these were usually mothers, wives, or daughters of Confederate soldiers doing this job. And this signature would be signed by one clerk, and the other signature would be signed by the other clerk. So you can see the difference in their signature handwriting style. So that's pretty cool tidbit about the signatures. So let's take a look at the vignette. We'll start with this portrait on the bottom right. So this is the famous Lieutenant General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, also known as Stonewall Jackson. He's wearing his Confederate uniform with 3 golden stars. And as I mentioned before, this is the only Confederate currency featuring a Confederate general. Stonewall Jackson was one of the most well-known and well-respected Confederate generals after Robert E. Lee, and he got his nickname Stonewall after the first battle of Civil War, which was called the Bull Run in Virginia. And the reason he was given that nickname was because the Union troops could not break through his lines. Now, he fought and won a lot of battles, but unfortunately in 1863, he was victim of friendly fire during the Battle of Chancellorsville, where his troops mistook him as a Union soldier and shot him. He was shot twice in his left arm, which was later amputated, but unfortunately he passed away due to pneumonia, presumably due to sepsis. So he passed away in May 1863, and this banknote was issued in 1864, and his portrait was placed to memorialize him. Now, there's a story about General Lee. When he found out that Stonewall Jackson has passed, he said those famous words that he lost his left arm, but I lost my right, hinting that Stonewall Jackson was his right-hand man. So this particular portrait, I think, is the reason why this banknote is so famous. Now let's look at the portrait or this design on the left. So there's lots going on. So on the top we have the Confederate Battle Flag. This is not the stars and bars. This is the Confederate Battle Flag. And underneath here we have the Seal of Confederacy, which features George Washington wearing his Revolutionary uniform and a tri-corner hat mounted on a horse. And this portrait is based on the Virginia-Washington Monument, which is located in Richmond, Virginia. That was designed by Thomas Crawford and built in around 1850s. So this is the Confederate seal, and along the border we have this, belt buckle, and the belt in the shape of a wreath with the Latin word Deo Vindice, which means God vindicates. So the Confederacy believed that Christianity did not oppose slavery, and that their cause was sanctioned by the divine, hence this Confederate motto. So besides the flag, the Confederate seal, on the bottom here we have all the different gear that you would have a Confederate soldier would have on them. We have the musket rifle, we have a musket cartridge box, also we have a single loop brass bugle. So really cool vignettes. So another thing about these notes is the fact that since they were hand cut, it's not uncommon to have very wavy or uneven margins. And a lot of banknotes are missing either the top or the bottom margin. I am lucky my example, all four margins are well preserved. Also, because of this hand-signed signatures, the ink that was used for these signatures was a iron gall ink, which over time tends to oxidize. So a black ink would turn kind of brownish color and have, brownish hue around it. And then it tends to bleed through the paper and show up on the back. And it only gets worse over time. So the oxidation because of iron in the ink causes all sorts of problems. But these banknotes were hand signed as a security measure. Luckily, my example, the hand signatures, the ink is still very crisp and black, and there's hardly any sign of oxidation. And, other than the paper being thin, there's not much bleeding through the back of the note. But if you have, blotches on the back of the note, that's just normal oxidation. Now, another thing about this banknote is the fact that this is uniface. If you have the lower denomination from the series of 1864, they all have a design on the back, except this particular note. And the reason is that all the back plates for the 1864 series, which were being delivered from England, were captured and destroyed by the Union Army. So the back plates for the lower denomination were recreated. So the lower denomination of $1, $2, $5, $10, $20, $50, and $100 have a back design, but I guess they did not recreate the back plate for the $500 denomination, and hence we have this uniface note. Also, I guess the inflation was through the roof, so to print the back design, you would waste more ink, and money and inflation, the ink and paper just costed a lot more, and it didn't make it worthwhile to put any effort in the back design. Either that or these were rushed out in a hurry to get them in circulation to pay for the finances. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video.